Hey guys! Tonight we wander into one of the most famous buildings ever constructed. Though right now it's strangely quiet. You stand in the middle of Rome long after sunset, when the crowds have thinned and the ancient stones seem to breathe a little easier. The Colosseum rises in front of you like a massive honey-colored skeleton of arches, softly lit by modern floodlights and the occasional passing scooter that hums somewhere in the distance. At this hour, the building feels less like a tourist attraction and more like a sleeping giant. You walk slowly across the worn paving stones, imagining what it must have been like nearly 2,000 years ago when this enormous amphitheater did not yet exist. Where you stand right now was once something very different, water shimmering under the Roman sun, reflecting the marble walls of an emperor's private pleasure garden. And yes, you're about to spend the next couple hours learning how Romans slowly, patiently built one of the most impressive stadiums in history, which, fair warning, also hosted events you probably wouldn't survive for more than about 30 seconds. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, feel free to drop a comment with your location and the local time where you're listening from. It's always fascinating seeing where in the world these sleepy history journeys reach. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You take a few steps closer to the Colosseum, running your fingers across the cool travertine blocks. Even today, the structure feels almost impossibly large, nearly 50 meters tall, elliptical, 4 stories of arches, thousands of tons of stone stacked together with careful Roman precision. But the first strange thing you notice is that the Colosseum wasn't built at the center of Rome by accident. It was built here very deliberately. 2,000 years ago, this spot held a shimmering artificial lake, part of the extravagant palace complex of the Emperor Nero. The palace was known as the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, and it sprawled across a huge portion of the city after the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE. Nero had, let's say, ambitious tastes in real estate. His palace complex included gardens, pavilions, banquet halls, and even that enormous private lake. Imagine a billionaire today bulldozing half a city block to install a personal yacht marina. Same energy. Mainstream historians generally agree that the lake was meant to imitate a peaceful countryside landscape, even though it sat in the middle of one of the busiest cities in the ancient world. Naturally, many Romans weren't thrilled about their emperor turning public land into his backyard water feature. Historians still argue whether Nero deliberately used the aftermath of the Great Fire to expand his palace or whether the destruction simply gave him an opportunity he couldn't resist. Either way, the result was a palace so enormous that people joked Rome itself had become Nero's front yard. Then things changed very quickly. Nero died in 68 CE after a chaotic political collapse. Within a year, Rome cycled through 4 different emperors in what historians now call the Year of the 4 Emperors. It was basically the imperial version of musical chairs, except the stakes were slightly higher. Eventually, a seasoned general named Vespasian emerged as the new ruler. And Vespasian had a clever idea. Standing here at the edge of Nero's artificial lake, you can almost imagine him surveying the scene and thinking, what if we returned this land to the people, but in the most spectacular way possible? Instead of an emperor's private playground, he would build something public, something enormous, something that would entertain tens of thousands of Romans at once. An amphitheater. A stadium unlike anything the world had seen. The decision wasn't just generous, it was political genius. By erasing Nero's private lake and replacing it with a massive public entertainment venue, Vespasian could send a powerful message. The new dynasty was giving Rome back to its citizens. You slowly circle the outer walls, imagining the area in the early days of construction. At first, there was no Colosseum, just workers draining the lake. And that alone was an engineering challenge. The basin had to be emptied, stabilized, and reinforced before any building could even begin. Thousands of laborers likely worked to redirect water and fill sections of the ground with rubble and soil. Roman engineers were already masters of large construction projects, but this site presented unique problems. It had once been a lake, which means the soil beneath it was soft. Building a 50-meter-tall stone arena on soggy ground is generally considered a bad architectural strategy. Even today, you might hesitate to build your garden shed over a former pond. The Romans, on the other hand, were about to construct one of the largest stadiums in history. Historians still argue whether the Romans completely drained the lake first or gradually filled it in with layers of debris and compacted earth. Either way, the process likely took several years before the first true foundations could begin. And speaking of foundations, the Colosseums are enormous, roughly 13 meters deep in some places. Imagine digging that by hand. No bulldozers, no cranes, just thousands of workers with picks, baskets, and a Roman supervisor who probably had the ancient equivalent of a clipboard and a very tired expression. Some historians estimate that up to 60,000 laborers may have been involved in the early stages of the project. Many of them were prisoners of war captured during Roman military campaigns, especially from the recent conquest of Judea. Which leads to one of those strange historical tidbits. There's an old fringe theory suggesting that some stones of the Colosseum were hauled into place by Jewish captives taken after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE. While many scholars think this is likely true for some laborers, the exact numbers remain debated. Still, it gives the construction a quiet, human dimension. Thousands of hands slowly shaping the future of Rome. As you look up at the towering arches now, it's easy to forget that at the beginning there was only mud, drained water, and an emperor with a political idea. A very large idea. Because once the foundations were ready, the real work could begin. Stone by stone, arch by arch. And the slow secret of the Colosseum's construction was never speed. It was patience. Rome wasn't built in a day, as the old saying goes. And the Colosseum certainly wasn't either. The project would stretch across nearly a decade, involve countless workers, and introduce engineering techniques so clever that parts of the building still stand today despite earthquakes, looting, and centuries of weather. But for now, you simply stand in the quiet Roman night, looking at the arches, listening to the soft echo of footsteps on stone, and imagining the moment when the lake finally disappeared, leaving behind a massive empty space where the greatest amphitheater in the ancient world was about to rise. Slowly, very slowly, you linger a moment longer beside the quiet outer wall, and it becomes easier to imagine what Rome must have felt like after Nero's death. The city was exhausted, suspicious of emperors, and probably more than a little tired of watching one ruler after another grab power like contestants in the least relaxing game show imaginable. In the year 69 CE, the Roman Empire went through what historians politely call a period of instability. In reality, it was chaos. 4 emperors ruled in a single year. First Galba, who lasted about 7 months before being assassinated. Then Otho, who lasted about 3 months before losing a civil war. Then Vitellius, who managed roughly 8 months before also losing a civil war. And finally, a tough, practical general named Vespasian. You picture him arriving in Rome not with theatrical flair but with the calm energy of a man who had spent most of his life in muddy military camps rather than marble palaces. Vespasian wasn't known for glamour. In fact, ancient writers describe him as fairly blunt, occasionally sarcastic, and refreshingly uninterested in extravagant luxury. Which, after Nero, must have felt like switching from fireworks to a steady lantern. Rome needed stability. And Vespasian understood something very important about politics in ancient Rome. The people loved entertainment. They loved chariot races. They loved festivals. And they absolutely loved gladiatorial games. So as you walk across the plaza in front of the Colosseum, you imagine the enormous symbolic act that Vespasian planned. Instead of restoring Nero's private lake, or leaving the area empty as an awkward reminder of imperial excess, he would build the largest amphitheater the Roman world had ever seen. A gift to the people. Or at least that's how it would be presented. In truth, it was also an incredibly clever piece of political theater. The new Flavian dynasty, Vespasian and his sons Titus and Domitian, needed legitimacy. They were not descended from famous imperial families like Julius Caesar or Augustus. They were practical men who had climbed through the ranks of the Roman military. So they built something that would make everyone remember their name. The Flavian Amphitheater. That was the building's original name. By the way, Colosseum only became popular centuries later, probably because of a gigantic statue nearby. That statue was the Colossus of Nero, a bronze figure over 30 meters tall that once depicted the emperor himself. After Nero's death, the statue was politely rebranded as the sun god instead, because in Rome, even statues sometimes needed a quick PR makeover. Historians still argue whether the statue's presence is the real reason the amphitheater eventually became known as the Colosseum. But the nickname certainly stuck. As you walk closer to the structure, you imagine the early planning stages. Roman architects did not start building immediately. First came surveying, measuring, and mapping the enormous oval footprint that would define the arena. The Colosseum's shape is elliptical rather than perfectly circular. About 189 meters long, 156 meters wide. This design wasn't just aesthetic, it allowed better visibility for spectators. No matter where you sat, you could see the center of the arena clearly. Which was important if, say, a lion suddenly appeared. Or a gladiator. Or, on rare occasions, both. But before any stone walls could rise, the drained lake basin had to be stabilized. You picture teams of workers hauling in massive quantities of rubble, broken bricks, and compacted soil. Layer after layer was pressed into place to create a stable base. Then came the foundation ring. This ring of concrete and stone formed the skeleton of the future amphitheater. It stretched in a massive oval, anchoring the structure firmly into the ground. Roman concrete, one of the empire's greatest inventions, played a crucial role here. Unlike modern concrete, Roman concrete often included volcanic ash called pozzolana. This magical ingredient allowed the mixture to harden even in damp conditions, which was extremely helpful when building on what used to be a lakebed. In other words, Roman engineers were already solving problems that would give many modern contractors a headache. Historians still argue whether the exact formula of Roman concrete varied depending on the region. But whatever they were mixing together worked extremely well. Some Roman structures built with this material have survived longer than many modern buildings. Which is slightly humbling if you think about it too long. Imagine spending millions on a modern stadium only to realize the Romans built one that lasted 2,000 years using volcanic ash and optimism. As the foundation walls began to take shape, the site must have looked like a massive quarry pit surrounded by scaffolding and activity. Thousands of laborers moved constantly, carrying baskets of earth, stacking stone blocks, and preparing wooden frameworks for the walls that would rise later. And there were a lot of walls to build. The Colosseum's design included multiple concentric rings of corridors and support structures. These rings distributed the enormous weight of the upper seating tiers across the foundation, preventing the building from collapsing under its own mass. You pause for a moment and imagine standing here during those early years. Dust in the air, hammering sounds echoing across the valley, ox carts creaking under heavy loads of stone, and Roman supervisors shouting instructions that probably sounded very official but also very tired. Because construction on this scale required relentless coordination. Stone shipments had to arrive on time. Workers had to follow precise architectural plans. And the emperor himself likely checked progress regularly, because when your building project is the largest entertainment venue in the empire, delays are not exactly ideal. One curious detail that historians sometimes mention is the speed of the project. Despite its enormous size, the Colosseum was completed astonishingly quickly, within about 8 to 10 years. That's incredibly fast for a structure of this scale, especially when you remember that everything was done by hand. No cranes, no power tools, just Roman ingenuity and an astonishing amount of manpower. But the real transformation of the landscape had only just begun. Because once the foundations were secure, the next phase would begin bringing stone from far beyond the city. Stone that would travel miles. Stone that would be lifted, carved, and placed into arches so perfectly balanced that many of them still stand today. And as you slowly walk beneath the looming arches in the quiet night air, you realize something. This peaceful place once sounded like the busiest construction site in the ancient world. Thousands of voices, thousands of tools, and a rising monument that grew a little taller every single day. You continue walking along the outer curve of the Colosseum, and the higher you look, the easier it becomes to imagine the moment when Emperor Vespasian officially decided that this project would happen. Not as an idea, not as a promise, but as a full imperial command. Somewhere in Rome around 72 CE, Vespasian likely approved the final plans for the massive amphitheater. The order would have traveled quickly through the imperial administration, architects summoned, engineers consulted, surveyors dispatched to the drained lake site you were just picturing. Suddenly, Rome had a new priority project. And not a small one. The amphitheater Vespasian envisioned would be the largest ever built in the Roman world. Earlier amphitheaters already existed across the empire, but most were much smaller, often made partly from wood or temporary structures. This one would be permanent. Massive. Stone. You pause beneath one of the arches and look upward again. Even in partial ruin, the scale is hard to process. Each level of arches forms a rhythmic pattern, row after row of openings, marching around the oval structure like disciplined soldiers. Originally there were 80 arches on the ground level alone. That meant 80 entrances, which was not just a design flourish, it was a practical solution. Roman architects had developed an astonishing system that allowed tens of thousands of spectators to enter and leave the building quickly. Each entrance was carefully numbered, guiding visitors to specific seating areas through a maze of corridors and staircases. Modern stadium designers still admire this system today. Some architectural historians even point out that many modern arenas borrow ideas directly from the Colosseum's layout. In other words, when you find your seat at a football stadium, you might unknowingly be following a design principle invented nearly 2,000 years ago. Not bad for a structure built before elevators. Speaking of design, historians still debate the identity of the Colosseum's main architect. Unlike many famous buildings today, the Romans didn't always celebrate individual architects as public celebrities, which means the mastermind behind this enormous project remains something of a mystery. Some scholars suggest a Roman engineer working under Vespasian's administration led the design team. Others think the project may have involved multiple architects collaborating over several years. Either way, whoever planned it had a remarkable understanding of weight distribution, crowd flow, and structural strength. Because building upward was the next great challenge. You imagine the construction site several years after the foundations were completed. Instead of an empty basin, the area now bustles with organized chaos. Wooden scaffolding climbs upward along sections of newly built walls. Workers haul blocks of pale travertine stone into place while others carve decorative details directly into the surfaces. The sound alone must have been overwhelming. Hammer on chisel, stone scraping against rope, oxen snorting as carts strain under heavy loads. And everywhere you look, dust. Lots of dust. Roman construction sites were not exactly known for their air quality. One of the most famous materials used in the Colosseum was travertine limestone from quarries near Tivoli, about 30 kilometers from Rome. These quarries supplied enormous blocks of stone that formed the visible outer walls of the amphitheater. You imagine the journey those stones took. Cut from the quarry, loaded onto wagons, dragged slowly across Roman roads by teams of oxen. Some estimates suggest that over 100,000 cubic meters of travertine were used in the Colosseum's construction. That's an amount of stone large enough to make modern logistics managers quietly lie down for a moment. The stones were connected using iron clamps rather than mortar. These clamps held blocks tightly together, creating strong joints throughout the structure. Ironically, those same clamps would later attract medieval looters who removed them to recycle the metal, leaving small holes in the stone that are still visible today. You might have noticed them earlier without realizing what they were. Little square scars scattered across the walls. The building's ancient hardware removed centuries later by people who probably thought, well, free iron. Historians still argue whether the Romans originally planned to cover more of the Colosseum's exterior with marble decoration. Some evidence suggests that certain sections may have been partially faced with decorative stone, giving the structure an even more dazzling appearance. But even without additional marble, the amphitheater already looked extraordinary. Each level of arches featured a different architectural style. The ground level used the sturdy Tuscan order, a simplified Roman version of Greek columns. Above that came the elegant Ionic order. And above that, the more decorative Corinthian order. In other words, as the building rose higher, the columns became increasingly fancy. It's almost like Roman architects thought, let's start simple, and then gradually show off. And show off they did. Because by the mid-70s CE, the Colosseum was rising rapidly. 3 levels of stone arcades began wrapping around the arena, forming the distinctive exterior silhouette that would eventually become one of the most recognizable buildings in the world. You imagine standing here during that phase of construction. Workers balancing on wooden scaffolding, engineers shouting measurements, ropes creaking as pulley systems lift stone blocks into position. Roman cranes, powered by human or animal labor, could lift surprisingly heavy loads using treadwheel mechanisms. Picture a giant wooden hamster wheel where workers walked inside to raise building materials. It was exhausting work, but very effective. And yes, if you're wondering, falling out of one of those wheels would definitely ruin your day. As the outer walls grew taller, the internal structure also expanded. Corridors and passageways began forming behind the arches, creating the complex circulation system that would later guide thousands of spectators to their seats. All of it carefully planned. All of it methodically built. Yet despite this rapid progress, Vespasian himself would never see the completed Colosseum. He died in 79 CE, only a few years before the amphitheater opened. But by the time of his death, the massive structure was already towering over Rome, its arches rising above the skyline like a stone promise that the Flavian dynasty intended to leave a permanent mark on the city. And as you stand beneath those same arches now, centuries later, it's hard not to feel that promise lingering quietly in the night air. The building was still unfinished, but the impossible project had clearly become real. Stone by stone, arch by arch, Rome's greatest arena was beginning to take shape. You drift slowly along the curve of the Colosseum, and as the night air cools the stone beneath your fingers, it becomes easier to imagine the moment when Roman engineers confronted the biggest quiet problem of the entire project. Not the arches, not the seating, not even the enormous weight of the future structure. The ground. Because beneath your feet lies something that once held water for years. Nero's artificial lake had soaked into the soil, softening layers that were never meant to support a 50-meter-tall amphitheater filled with tens of thousands of enthusiastic Romans. If you've ever tried building a sandcastle too close to the tide, you already understand the basic engineering dilemma. Roman builders understood it too. So before the Colosseum could truly rise, they had to make the earth behave itself. You picture the site again in the early 70s CE. The drained basin is now a massive pit of activity, with thousands of workers digging trenches in wide oval patterns. The foundation ring of the amphitheater had already been planned with remarkable precision. And now the engineers were reinforcing it layer by careful layer. The foundation of the Colosseum is essentially a giant concrete oval about 13 meters deep and nearly 200 meters long. That is not a small hole. You imagine the digging process alone. Workers with iron picks chip away at the soil while others shovel the loose earth into baskets. Lines of laborers pass those baskets along like an ancient assembly line until the soil is finally dumped outside the construction zone. No excavators. No dump trucks. Just patience and muscle. Some estimates suggest that tens of thousands of cubic meters of earth were removed before the foundations were ready. And all of it had to happen in the Roman sun, which, if you've ever visited Rome in summer, you know has a very strong personality. At some point, Roman engineers likely reached the stable ground beneath the old lakebed. That's when the real foundation layers began. First came large stones and rubble packed tightly together. Then thick pours of Roman concrete. Then additional stone layers to distribute weight evenly across the entire oval footprint. Roman concrete, as you heard earlier, was one of the empire's secret weapons. Mixed with volcanic ash from regions around the Bay of Naples, the material hardened into an extremely durable substance. Historians still argue whether the Romans fully understood the chemical magic happening inside their concrete mixtures, or whether they simply discovered the perfect recipe through experience. Either way, the result worked remarkably well. In fact, some modern engineers studying ancient structures have found that Roman concrete can actually grow stronger over time when exposed to certain minerals in groundwater, which is slightly unfair to modern concrete, which tends to crack if you look at it the wrong way. You continue imagining the foundation stage. The huge oval ring slowly fills with stone and hardened concrete. Once the base layer is secure, the outer walls of the amphitheater begin rising directly from this foundation. But here's where Roman engineering becomes especially clever. Instead of building a solid mass of stone walls, which would be dangerously heavy, the Colosseum uses a network of radial walls and ring-shaped corridors. These structural ribs distribute the building's weight outward and downward, reducing pressure on any single point of the foundation. Think of it like the skeleton of a whale. Strong ribs. Open spaces in between. A design that allows enormous size without crushing the ground beneath it. And those open spaces would eventually become something else. Corridors where tens of thousands of spectators could move through the building quickly. But that comes later. For now, the engineers are focused on keeping the entire structure stable. Another fascinating detail appears during this phase of construction: drainage. Remember, this site used to be a lake. Rainwater would naturally collect here if nothing was done. Roman engineers solved this by installing drainage channels beneath parts of the foundation, allowing water to flow away from the structure. You imagine narrow tunnels carved beneath the stone base, quietly guiding water toward the city's sewer systems. Because nothing ruins a giant amphitheater faster than an unexpected indoor swimming pool. Although, to be fair, the Romans occasionally did flood arenas for naval battle reenactments, but we'll get to that strange idea much later. As the foundations continue rising, wooden scaffolding spreads across the site like a forest of beams. Workers climb ladders carrying tools, ropes, and baskets of mortar. Roman foremen shout instructions. Surveyors double-check measurements. And somewhere nearby, Imperial officials probably stand with folded arms making sure the emperor's grand project stays on schedule. Because Vespasian wanted results. The Flavian dynasty needed a monument that could symbolize stability after years of civil war. The Colosseum was more than a stadium. It was a public statement that Rome was back under control. You picture the emperor visiting the site occasionally, perhaps standing on a temporary platform overlooking the foundations, dust swirling around his sandals, thousands of workers moving like ants across the massive oval. And slowly, the shape of the amphitheater becomes visible even before the seating rises. The radial foundation walls now outline the internal skeleton of the building. Corridors, support structures, passageways that will someday guide crowds through the building with astonishing efficiency. Historians still argue whether the Romans anticipated just how well this circulation system would work, or whether some of its brilliance emerged naturally during construction. But once the foundations were complete, the most difficult part of the entire project was finished. The ground was stable. The base was secure. And now, finally, the Colosseum could begin rising upward in earnest. Above the earth, above the former lake, above the quiet political embarrassment of Nero's extravagant garden. The giant amphitheater was no longer just a plan. It was becoming a permanent feature of Rome's skyline. And with the foundations locked firmly into place, the next stage would bring something even more dramatic. Stone. Huge quantities of stone. Blocks cut from distant quarries that would soon travel toward Rome in endless caravans. Because if the foundations were the bones of the Colosseum, the stone walls were about to become its skin. You continue tracing the curve of the Colosseum's outer wall. And now your attention shifts to the pale stone itself. Even under the soft yellow lights of modern Rome, the blocks glow faintly like dried honey. This is travertine. And long before it became the skin of the Colosseum, it lived an entirely different life far outside the city. About 30 kilometers east of Rome lies the area of Tivoli, where vast quarries have supplied building stone since ancient times. If you imagine traveling back 2,000 years, the quarries would look like enormous wounds carved into the hillsides, giant staircases of rock where teams of workers chipped away at the limestone layer by layer. The Romans loved travertine for several reasons. It was strong. It was relatively easy to cut into blocks. And it had a pleasant pale color that made buildings appear bright under the Mediterranean sun. You imagine standing at the quarry sometime around the mid-70s CE. Workers hammer iron wedges into narrow grooves carved into the stone face. One wedge after another is tapped into place until, eventually, the rock gives up a long rectangular block with a sharp cracking sound. That block might weigh several tons, which immediately creates the next problem. How do you move it? The answer, as usual in the Roman world, involves patience, animals, and a truly heroic amount of rope. Large wooden sledges were often used to drag heavy stones across short distances inside the quarry. From there, the blocks were loaded onto wagons pulled by oxen teams. Roman roads were excellent for their time, but even the best stone-paved road becomes a challenge when you're hauling something the size of a small car. You picture the slow procession moving toward Rome. Wagons creaking. Oxen snorting. Drivers shouting encouragement that probably sounded suspiciously like mild insults. The journey from Tivoli to the city might take days depending on the load and road conditions. And remember, this wasn't a single delivery. It was thousands of deliveries. Historians estimate that roughly 100,000 cubic meters of travertine were used in the Colosseum's outer walls. If stacked together, that amount of stone would form a mountain large enough to make modern construction managers quietly reconsider their career choices. And yet, somehow, the Romans managed it. The blocks arrived at the construction site where teams of masons carefully shaped them into precise rectangular pieces. Roman stoneworkers were astonishingly skilled. Each block had to fit snugly against its neighbors, forming the elegant arcs of the Colosseum's famous outer arches. You step back and look at those arches again. Even today they form a perfect rhythm around the building. Arch, arch, arch. 80 of them on the ground level. Each one framed by stone columns and decorative details that still survive after centuries of weather, earthquakes, and enthusiastic souvenir hunters. One interesting detail about the Colosseum's stonework is that very little mortar was used to hold the outer walls together. Instead, iron clamps connected the blocks from the inside. Small channels were carved into the stone, and iron brackets were inserted to lock neighboring pieces together. Think of it like giant ancient staples. These clamps held the structure firmly in place, allowing the enormous arches to distribute weight efficiently across the building's skeleton. Historians still argue about exactly how many iron clamps were used, but the number must have been enormous. And here's where things get slightly tragic and slightly amusing. Centuries later, during the Middle Ages, people began removing those iron clamps to melt them down for other uses. Metal was valuable, and the Colosseum looked like a convenient supply warehouse. When the clamps were removed, the surrounding stone cracked slightly, leaving behind small rectangular holes that you can still see scattered across the walls today. So if you ever notice those strange little cavities in the stone, you're basically looking at the empty sockets where ancient hardware used to live. A kind of archaeological version of someone stealing all the screws from your furniture. Meanwhile, as the outer walls rose higher, the internal parts of the amphitheater were also developing rapidly. Behind the travertine facade, Roman builders used lighter materials such as brick and tufa stone to construct corridors, stairways, and support walls. This clever combination reduced the overall weight of the structure while keeping the visible exterior strong and elegant. The Romans were masters of mixing materials for maximum efficiency. Travertine where strength mattered most. Brick and concrete where flexibility helped. Marble where decoration made a statement. Speaking of marble, historians still argue whether large sections of the Colosseum's interior were once covered in polished marble panels. Some fragments discovered during excavations suggest that parts of the seating areas and walkways gleamed with white stone. Imagine the building when it was brand new. Not the weathered honey color you see today, but bright stone walls, fresh carvings, and polished surfaces reflecting sunlight across the arena. It must have been dazzling, almost blindingly bright, and very Roman. Because Romans loved spectacle. They loved large spaces, dramatic architecture, and public gatherings that made the city feel alive. The Colosseum was designed to be more than just a sports arena. It was a stage where the empire could show its wealth, power, and engineering brilliance all at once. You imagine a visitor approaching the building around 75 CE. The outer walls now stand several stories high. Scaffolding clings to the arches like wooden vines. Hundreds of workers move across the site hauling ropes, chisels, and pulleys. Ox carts unload fresh blocks of travertine. Stone dust drifts through the air. And somewhere high above the ground, a mason carefully taps a chisel into place, shaping one more piece of the enormous puzzle. Because the Colosseum was never built in a single dramatic moment. It grew slowly, block by block, arch by arch, delivery by delivery. And while the city of Rome bustled around it, markets opening, senators arguing, street vendors shouting, the great amphitheater continued rising quietly in the background. A stone giant assembling itself one careful piece at a time. But the stone alone could not build it. Behind every block stood thousands of human hands. Laborers, engineers, slaves, craftsmen, an entire hidden workforce whose effort made the emperor's grand project possible. And soon, you'll step into that world of workers. Because the Colosseum was not just an engineering marvel. It was also the product of one of the largest construction teams the ancient world had ever assembled. You move along the shadowy curve of the Colosseum, and as the city grows quieter around you, it becomes easier to imagine the thousands of people who once filled this space long before it became an arena. Not spectators. Workers. Builders. Carpenters. Stonecutters. Engineers. And a great many individuals whose names history never recorded. If you stood here during the peak construction years in the 70s CE, the area around the amphitheater would have felt less like a monument and more like the busiest worksite in the entire Roman Empire. Dust in the air, voices everywhere, and the constant rhythmic tapping of tools against stone. Historians estimate that somewhere between 30,000 and 60,000 laborers may have been involved in constructing the Colosseum at various stages. The exact number remains debated, but the workforce was enormous by ancient standards. And it wasn't a single type of worker. The project required a whole hierarchy of specialists. At the top were Roman engineers and architects, educated men trained in geometry, construction methods, and the mathematics required to keep an enormous stone structure standing upright instead of collapsing dramatically in front of everyone. These engineers supervised the overall design and structural planning. Below them were master craftsmen, skilled stone masons who knew exactly how to cut travertine blocks to precise dimensions, carpenters who built scaffolding, lifting devices, and the complex wooden frameworks needed during construction, metalworkers who forged iron clamps, tools, and reinforcement pieces. Then came the bulk of the workforce, laborers who carried stone, mixed concrete, dug trenches, dragged ropes, and performed the endless physical tasks required to keep the entire project moving forward. Many of these workers were likely free Roman citizens earning wages. Construction projects in Rome often employed large numbers of paid laborers, especially when the state funded the work. But there was also another group: slaves. Lots of them. One widely accepted historical fact is that many prisoners captured during Rome's conquest of Judea around 70 CE were brought to the capital and forced into labor. Ancient historians like Josephus mention large numbers of captives taken after the destruction of Jerusalem. Some scholars believe these prisoners contributed to major construction projects in Rome, including the Colosseum. Historians still argue about exactly how many of them were used on this site. But the possibility adds a quiet layer of human reality beneath the grand architecture. Because behind every arch you see tonight were countless hands lifting, carving, and hauling. Not all of them by choice. You imagine the construction site early in the morning. The sun barely rising over the hills of Rome. Workers arriving in groups, some carrying tools over their shoulders. Foremen shouting assignments. Wooden scaffolding creaking as people climb upward to their stations. The Roman workday was long. Probably sunrise to late afternoon, depending on the season. And the tasks were repetitive. Cut stone. Lift stone. Move stone. Repeat. If someone had invented podcasts back then, productivity might have improved dramatically. One fascinating detail about Roman construction sites is the use of cranes powered by human effort. These cranes used large wooden wheels, tread wheels, where workers walked inside like hamsters, turning the mechanism that lifted heavy loads. You picture two men stepping inside the wheel. They start walking. The wheel turns slowly. Ropes tighten. And somewhere above them, a massive stone block begins rising gently into the air. It's surprisingly efficient. Historians studying surviving Roman cranes believe some could lift several tons at a time. Which is impressive when you remember the entire system runs on leg power and good engineering. But cranes weren't the only tools in use. Pulley systems hung from wooden frames. Ramps allowed stones to be dragged upward gradually. And endless ropes, thick, fibrous ropes, helped guide loads into position. Safety regulations, however, were probably not what you'd expect from a modern construction site. Hard hats did not exist. Guardrails were rare. And if you slipped from a high scaffold, the Roman equivalent of workplace insurance was essentially, "Please try not to fall." Still, the workforce developed a rhythm. Teams specialized in certain tasks. Stone masons shaped blocks all day. Concrete mixers prepared huge batches of mortar and structural fill. Carpenters repaired scaffolding and lifting devices as the structure grew taller. And everywhere you look, supervisors keep the work organized. Because coordination was essential, thousands of workers had to move efficiently without getting in each other's way. Deliveries from quarries had to arrive on schedule. Tools had to be maintained. Measurements had to remain precise. One wrong alignment in an arch could cause serious structural problems later. Roman builders knew this, which is why the arches of the Colosseum were constructed with extraordinary care. Each stone wedge, called a voussoir, was carefully shaped so that the weight of the arch pressed the pieces tightly together. The central keystone locked everything in place. Once inserted, the arch became incredibly strong. You glance upward again at the rows of arches circling the building. Hundreds of them, each one assembled by human hands standing on wooden platforms nearly 2,000 years ago. There's also a curious historical rumor connected to the workforce. Some ancient writers claimed that construction sites sometimes had musicians playing nearby to keep laborers working in rhythm. Think of it as the ancient version of motivational background music. Historians still argue whether this actually happened regularly, but the idea of someone playing a flute while thousands of people haul stone is oddly charming. And possibly very necessary, because the work went on for years. Day after day, season after season, summer heat, winter rain. The Colosseum kept rising. More arches, more corridors, more stone, until the massive skeleton of the amphitheater began dominating the skyline of Rome. From distant hills, travelers approaching the city would see it growing larger every year. A stone oval slowly climbing toward the sky. A monument built not only by emperors and architects, but by thousands of ordinary workers whose effort is still quietly embedded in every block. And as you stand beneath those arches tonight, the building almost seems to remember them. All those footsteps, all those voices, all those long days of lifting stone. Because the Colosseum may look like a monument to emperors, but in truth, it was built by an army of builders. You pause beneath another arch, and now your attention shifts away from the stone blocks themselves to something less visible, but possibly even more important. The material quietly holding much of the Colosseum together. Roman concrete. It may not sound glamorous. Concrete rarely gets invited to fancy architectural parties. But in the Roman world, it was the quiet superstar of engineering. Without it, the Colosseum would likely have remained an ambitious sketch on parchment rather than a towering amphitheater that still stands after nearly 2,000 years. As you imagine the construction site again in the mid-70s CE, you notice teams of workers gathered around large mixing areas. They shovel materials into wide pits, lime, rubble, small stones, and the mysterious gray powder that Roman builders prized above almost everything else. Volcanic ash. Specifically, a type called pozzolana, often collected from regions near the Bay of Naples. When mixed with lime and water, this ash created a chemical reaction that hardened into an incredibly durable substance. Unlike many modern concrete mixtures, Roman concrete actually bonded extremely well with stone and could set even in damp environments. Which, as you may remember from that former lakebed situation, was extremely helpful. You picture laborers dumping buckets of ash into mixing pits, stirring the mixture with long wooden paddles while others add crushed stone fragments to strengthen the mass. The result is a thick gray slurry that looks a little like ancient construction oatmeal. Not very glamorous, but very effective. Historians still argue whether Roman builders fully understood the chemistry behind their concrete or simply followed recipes passed down through generations of engineers. Some scholars believe Roman architects carefully adjusted mixtures depending on where the concrete would be used. More ash for strength, more stone for bulk, less water for structural layers. Either way, the material proved astonishingly resilient. Recent studies of Roman harbor structures show that ancient concrete sometimes became stronger when exposed to seawater over long periods. Minerals formed new crystal structures inside the concrete, reinforcing it from within, which is slightly embarrassing for modern concrete, which occasionally develops cracks just from existing near weather. But concrete wasn't the only hidden innovation inside the Colosseum. Behind the elegant travertine exterior, much of the internal structure used a clever combination of brick and concrete walls. These lighter materials formed the maze of corridors and support ribs that allowed the massive amphitheater to remain stable without becoming impossibly heavy. You imagine walking through the construction site again. From the outside, the arches look majestic and carefully carved. But step inside the half-finished structure and you would find a completely different world, a network of raw concrete walls, brick arches, wooden scaffolding, and open corridors where workers move constantly between sections. The Colosseum is almost like two buildings at once. A beautiful stone facade for the public, and a hidden structural skeleton doing the real work behind the scenes. That skeleton is arranged in concentric rings. Circular corridors wrap around the arena floor while radial passageways slice through them like spokes on a giant wheel. This layout serves two purposes. First, it spreads the building's enormous weight evenly across the foundation. Second, it creates one of the most efficient crowd management systems ever invented in the ancient world. Imagine 50,000 people arriving for a gladiator event. That's the population of a small city. Yet Roman engineers designed the Colosseum so those spectators could enter, find their seats, and exit again with surprising speed. Historians still argue whether the builders anticipated quite how effective this circulation system would become. But modern stadium architects still study the design today. And honestly, when you think about it, the Romans were already solving the same problem modern arenas face: how to prevent thousands of excited fans from turning the entrances into a chaotic traffic jam. You glance upward again at the arches. Each level is carefully stacked above the next, but the structure doesn't feel heavy. That's because the Romans used something called vaulting, curved concrete ceilings that distribute weight outward instead of straight downward. Barrel vaults, groin vaults, a whole vocabulary of curved structures working quietly together. If you walked through the interior corridors during construction, you'd see wooden frames supporting these vaults as wet concrete hardened above them. Once the material set, the wooden forms could be removed, leaving behind strong curved ceilings capable of holding enormous loads. It's like building a stone cave that supports an entire stadium. And yet, even with all this engineering brilliance, construction still required careful supervision. Roman engineers used measuring rods, plumb lines, and leveling tools to ensure walls remained straight and arches aligned properly. Geometry was critical. One misaligned arch could cause stress fractures in other parts of the structure. You imagine an architect standing on a wooden platform, squinting down a measuring line while workers adjust a block by just a few centimeters. A tiny correction, but essential for the long-term stability of the entire building. There's also a quirky historical rumor about Roman builders using small lead tags or markings on stone blocks to identify which quarry they came from or which crew installed them. Historians still debate whether these markings served as quality control or simply helped track labor teams. Either way, the idea that ancient construction crews might have left little stone signatures hidden inside the Colosseum is strangely charming. a quiet reminder that thousands of individuals contributed to its creation. As the years passed, more of the structure began closing in around the central arena. The outer walls climbed higher. The internal corridors multiplied. Staircases appeared, linking level after level of seating. The amphitheater was no longer just a framework. It was becoming a complex machine designed to hold crowds, direct movement, and stage dramatic spectacles. And all of it rested on those hidden innovations: Roman concrete, clever vaulting, and a structural skeleton carefully balanced between strength and efficiency. From the outside, the Colosseum looked like a monument. But inside, it was something more subtle. A masterpiece of engineering quietly hiding behind beautiful arches. And as you continue your slow walk around the ancient structure tonight, the deeper layers of that design begin revealing themselves. Because the next stage of construction would shape one of the most recognizable features of the entire building. The arches rising toward the Roman sky. You continue along the outer ring of the Colosseum, and now your gaze naturally lifts upward. The higher levels rise above you in soft golden light, each row of arches stacked carefully upon the next. Even in ruin, the structure looks balanced, calm, almost effortless. But if you imagine the building site during the late stages of construction, nothing about it would have felt effortless at all. By the mid to late 70s CE, the Colosseum had already reached an impressive height. The first 3 levels of arcades, those long rows of repeating arches, were rising steadily around the oval structure, giving Rome its first true glimpse of the amphitheater's final shape. From a distance, it must have looked like a giant stone crown emerging from the city floor. Travelers approaching Rome on distant roads would begin spotting it above rooftops, its pale travertine glowing under the Italian sun. And the higher it grew, the more complicated the work became. You imagine the construction crews climbing wooden scaffolding that now reaches several stories into the air. Thick beams crisscross the outer walls like an enormous wooden spiderweb, supporting platforms where masons kneel while carving and positioning stone blocks. Below them, cranes creak and groan as they lift new pieces into place. Roman cranes were remarkable machines. They used a system of pulleys and tread wheels, those giant wooden hamster wheels we talked about earlier, allowing workers to lift surprisingly heavy loads with controlled effort. A few men walking steadily inside the wheel could raise blocks weighing several tons. It wasn't fast, but it was reliable. And reliability was exactly what the Colosseum needed. Each arch required precise assembly. The curved opening wasn't made from a single stone but from multiple wedge-shaped blocks called voussoirs. These stones were carefully cut so that when arranged together they formed a perfect curve. The final piece, the keystone, locked everything into position. Once the keystone was placed, gravity itself held the arch stable. The weight of the stones pressed inward, making the structure stronger rather than weaker. It's one of those elegant engineering tricks that feels almost magical when you think about it. No glue, no metal frame, just stone leaning against stone in exactly the right way. You walk a little farther and count a few arches with your eyes. Ground level, second level, third level. Each tier is slightly different. On the first level, the columns follow the Tuscan order, simple and sturdy, a Roman adaptation of Greek architectural styles. These columns look muscular, almost practical, as if they're ready to hold up the entire empire. The second level introduces the Ionic order, with more decorative capitals curling gently like stone scrolls. And the third level displays the Corinthian order, the most ornate of the classical styles. The capitals here bloom outward with carved leaves and elegant detail. It's almost like the building is gradually putting on fancier clothes as it grows taller. Historians still argue whether this progression of column styles was meant purely for aesthetics or if it symbolized Rome's admiration for Greek culture. The Romans borrowed heavily from Greek architecture, but they also loved demonstrating that they could build even bigger. Think of it as friendly architectural competition, just on a very imperial scale. Meanwhile, inside the building, the network of corridors and staircases was becoming increasingly complex. Workers laid down floors, built vaulted ceilings, and carved stairways that spiraled upward through the structure. Eventually, these passageways would allow more than 50,000 spectators to move through the amphitheater without complete chaos breaking out. Which, given the Roman love of large gatherings, was a very wise decision. One of the most impressive features was the system of vomitoria, a wonderfully dramatic Latin word for the entrances that allowed crowds to flow in and out quickly. Despite what modern jokes suggest, the term has nothing to do with overeating at Roman banquets. Instead, the word simply refers to passages that spew forth crowds into the seating areas. Picture dozens of corridors opening directly into rows of seats, guiding spectators efficiently to their assigned sections. Even today, stadium designers still use similar concepts. So the next time you exit a crowded sports arena quickly, you might quietly thank a Roman architect from 2,000 years ago. Back on the construction site, the arches continue rising around the amphitheater like a carefully choreographed dance of stone. Masons carve decorative moldings. Laborers haul new blocks up ramps and scaffolding. Engineers check alignments with measuring rods and plumb lines. And slowly, very slowly, the Colosseum's iconic silhouette begins to appear. By now the building dominates the skyline. Rome already has many impressive structures, temples, baths, basilicas, but this amphitheater stands apart because of its sheer scale. It looks less like a building and more like a small mountain of arches. There's also a curious historical rumor about how the uppermost level was completed. Some scholars believe the final tier of the Colosseum used more brick and concrete rather than heavy stone, making it lighter and easier to build at great height. This upper section included large rectangular openings where wooden poles could later be inserted. Those poles would support something rather unexpected: a giant retractable awning. But we'll get to that later. For now, the workers are still focused on finishing the stone arcades that define the amphitheater's exterior. You imagine the moment when the final keystone of the last arch was placed. The scaffolding still surrounds the walls. Dust drifts through the air. But suddenly the great oval of arches stands complete, level after level circling the arena like ripples frozen in stone. From this point forward, the Colosseum no longer looks like a construction project. It looks like a finished monument. A vast amphitheater rising proudly above the former Lake of Nero. And yet, despite its impressive exterior, much of the most fascinating work is still happening inside. Because beyond those arches lies the complex world of seating tiers, where Roman society itself will soon be organized, ranked, and displayed. Quite literally. Stone seats waiting patiently for tens of thousands of spectators. You step through one of the great arches and imagine entering the Colosseum while construction is nearing completion. Outside, the building already looks magnificent. But inside, the amphitheater is still buzzing with finishing work. Stone dust lingers in the air. Workers move up and down stairways carrying tools. And everywhere you look, the seating tiers are slowly taking shape. This is where Roman society itself will soon sit, quite literally arranged in layers of stone. You walk up a gently sloping corridor, following one of the many passageways that spiral around the interior of the building. The design is surprisingly intuitive, even without signs or modern lighting. The layout naturally guides you upward toward different seating levels. This is not accidental. Roman architects carefully planned the interior circulation so that crowds could move efficiently through the structure. Each entrance on the outer wall leads to specific staircases and corridors, directing spectators toward the section where they are allowed to sit. And allowed is the key word. Because seating in the Colosseum was strictly organized according to Roman social hierarchy. The closer you sat to the arena floor, the higher your social status. The lowest rows, right beside the arena, were reserved for Rome's most powerful individuals. Senators, magistrates, and high-ranking officials occupied marble seats in the podium section. These seats were the most comfortable and the most prestigious. Some even had the names of senators carved directly into the stone. Imagine showing up late and discovering someone already sitting in your personalized marble chair. Roman politics was already tense enough without that kind of seating drama. Just above the senators sat the equites, the wealthy knightly class of Roman society. These were successful businessmen, military officers, and influential citizens who held considerable wealth but slightly less political authority than the senators. They still got very good seats. Above them came the ordinary male citizens of Rome. Row after row of stone benches stretched upward across the middle tiers of the amphitheater. These sections could hold thousands of people, forming a vast semicircle around the arena floor. You picture the completed Colosseum on the day of an event. 50,000 spectators entering through the 80 arches. Sandals scraping against stone steps. Voices echoing through corridors. And everyone gradually finding their assigned level in the social ladder of seating. Historians generally agree that the total capacity of the Colosseum ranged between 50,000 and 65,000 spectators depending on how tightly people were packed. That's roughly the size of many modern sports stadiums. And remember, this was built without steel beams, electrical systems, or digital ticket scanners. Just clever architecture. You continue imagining the interior during its final construction stages. Workers carve the stone seating blocks carefully, smoothing surfaces so spectators can sit comfortably during long events. The upper levels use lighter materials, including brick and concrete, to reduce the load on the lower structure. Because if 50,000 Romans all leaned forward at the same time during a dramatic moment, the building had to remain perfectly stable. Historians still argue whether the exact seating arrangements changed slightly over time, especially as emperors modified the arena during later centuries. But the overall hierarchy remained clear. Power at the bottom, common citizens above, and at the very top, the highest, steepest section, sat women and the poorest members of Roman society. It was not exactly the most progressive seating chart in history, but it reflected Roman social order with perfect clarity. You climb higher in your imagination, reaching the upper tiers where the seating becomes steeper and narrower. From here the arena floor looks much smaller, like a stage viewed from the balcony of a giant theater. And yet even the cheapest seats still offer a clear view. That was part of the genius of the Colosseum's elliptical design. Unlike a circular arena, the oval shape brings spectators closer to the center from all sides. No matter where you sit, you can see the action. Which was important, because the Romans were extremely enthusiastic spectators. There's an amusing detail that historians sometimes mention about Roman crowd behavior. During popular events, spectators often brought cushions to soften the stone seats, because sitting on bare marble for several hours can become uncomfortable even if you're watching gladiators. Vendors likely moved through the crowd selling snacks and drinks. Think of it as the ancient version of stadium concessions. Although the menu probably included olives, bread, and wine rather than hot dogs and soda. One curious rumor suggests that small clay tokens may have been used to assign seating sections for some events. These tokens could correspond to numbered entrances, guiding spectators through the maze of corridors toward their seats. Historians still debate how common this system was, but it would make sense given the sheer number of people attending games. Imagine 50,000 Romans trying to find seats without any organization. Even the most patient Roman engineer would probably need a nap after that. Back in the construction period, however, the seating tiers are still being finalized. Stonecutters shape the last rows. Bricklayers finish the upper corridors. and carpenters construct railings and barriers to keep spectators safely in place. Because when you stack tens of thousands of people on steep stone steps, safety becomes very important. The arena floor itself, still empty for now, lies at the center like a giant stage waiting for its first performance. But beneath that floor, something else is beginning to take shape. A hidden world. Dark corridors, cages, mechanical platforms, the underground labyrinth known as the hypogeum. And while the spectators above will one day cheer, laugh, and gasp at the spectacles unfolding in the arena, most of them will never fully understand the complex machinery operating quietly beneath their feet. A hidden system of tunnels and lifts. A backstage world preparing animals, props, and performers for dramatic entrances. Because the Colosseum was not only designed to hold crowds, it was designed to surprise them. You descend a narrow stairway in your imagination, leaving the bright seating tiers behind. The air grows cooler, the light fades, and gradually you enter the hidden world beneath the arena floor. This underground network is known as the hypogeum, a word that simply means under the earth. And despite being one of the most fascinating parts of the Colosseum today, it was never meant to be seen by the spectators sitting above. To them, the arena floor appeared as a smooth stretch of sand, glowing under the Roman sun. But beneath that sand lay a complicated system of tunnels, chambers, and mechanical platforms that made the entire spectacle possible. Right now, during the final construction years in the late 70s CE, this underground labyrinth is still being assembled. You step into the dim corridors in your mind and imagine the worksite here. Rows of brick walls divide the underground space into long passageways. Torches flicker along the corridors, casting shadows across unfinished stone floors. Workers move through the tunnels carrying beams of wood, metal fittings, and ropes. Because the hypogeum is not just storage space, it's a stage machine. Roman engineers designed this underground network to prepare animals, gladiators, scenery, and props before suddenly revealing them in the arena above. Imagine watching an event in the Colosseum when, without warning, a trapdoor bursts open and a lion appears in the middle of the sand. From the spectator's perspective, it almost looks like magic. From the engineer's perspective, it requires a surprisingly complicated system of elevators, ramps, and cages. Historians generally agree that the hypogeum was likely completed slightly after the Colosseum first opened, probably during the reign of Emperor Domitian, Vespasian's younger son. But construction of its foundations and basic corridors began while the main amphitheater was still being finished. Historians still argue about exactly how the earliest version of the hypogeum looked, because later renovations changed parts of the system. However, archaeological evidence shows a dense network of walls dividing the underground area into long chambers. These chambers were used for multiple purposes. Some held cages for wild animals, others stored scenery and stage equipment, and some served as holding areas for gladiators waiting for their moment to enter the arena. You picture one of the animal cages. Heavy wooden bars reinforced with iron. Inside, perhaps a lion imported from North Africa or a leopard captured in the eastern provinces of the empire. Rome's arena spectacles often featured exotic animals from across the Mediterranean world. Lions, tigers, bears, even giraffes and rhinoceroses occasionally appeared in Roman games. Transporting these animals to Rome was already an enormous logistical challenge, but once they arrived, they needed to be managed carefully beneath the arena until the right moment in the performance. And that's where the mechanical lifts came in. Roman engineers constructed vertical shafts connecting the hypogeum to the arena floor above. Inside these shafts sat wooden platforms that could be raised using rope and pulley systems. You imagine the mechanism in action. A cage containing an animal sits on a platform beneath the floor. Workers below pull ropes attached to a large capstan, a rotating wooden drum that winds the rope upward. Slowly the platform rises. Above, a trapdoor opens. And suddenly the animal appears on the sand. Spectators gasp. The show continues. Historians studying the ruins believe the Colosseum may have had as many as 25 to 30 of these lift systems operating at once. That's a remarkable number of moving parts for an ancient building. Picture dozens of workers below the arena coordinating their efforts to raise cages, scenery, or even performers at exactly the right moment. If one rope slipped or one platform jammed, the entire dramatic reveal might fail. And while Roman engineers were incredibly skilled, you can probably imagine that the occasional mishap occurred. Historians sometimes mention a curious rumor about the hypogeum corridors being so busy during events that workers needed clear signals, possibly whistles or shouted commands, to coordinate the lifting machines. Think of it as the backstage crew of the ancient world. Busy, sweaty, and hoping the trapdoor above opens exactly when it's supposed to. The underground passages also included small ramps that allowed gladiators to walk toward the arena entrance. Imagine waiting down here before a fight. Torchlight flickering on brick walls. The distant roar of 50,000 spectators echoing through the stone above. Sand drifting down from the arena floor. It must have been an intense place. And yet the hypogeum itself was carefully engineered to remain hidden from the audience. The arena floor above was made from wooden planks covered in sand. These planks rested on beams that spanned the underground chambers, creating a flat stage where combat and performances could take place. The sand served several purposes. It improved traction for fighters. It absorbed blood and moisture. And it helped conceal the trapdoors scattered across the arena surface. Historians still debate exactly how many trapdoors existed, but archaeological evidence suggests there were dozens, each one part of the carefully choreographed machinery beneath. As construction of the hypogeum continues, you imagine workers finishing the last corridors and installing wooden mechanisms that will soon operate during the games. Above them, the seating tiers are almost complete. The arches outside shine in fresh stone. The Colosseum now stands ready to become the greatest entertainment venue in the Roman world. But the audience will never see this underground world clearly. To them, the arena will appear almost magical. Animals emerging from nowhere. Scenery rising from the earth. Dramatic entrances that feel sudden and surprising. All thanks to the quiet engineering hidden beneath the sand. And as you stand once again beneath the arches tonight, it's strange to think that below the peaceful ruins lies the blueprint of an ancient stage machine, one designed to astonish an entire empire. You remain beneath the arena in your imagination for a moment longer. Because the deeper you explore the hypogeum, the more it begins to feel like the backstage machinery of an enormous theater. Except this theater sits under 50,000 spectators. And instead of stage lights and microphones, the technology here runs on rope, wood, and a very determined group of Roman engineers. You move down one of the narrow underground corridors. The ceiling above is supported by brick arches, and the air smells faintly of dust, wood, and animal straw. Torches flicker along the walls while workers adjust ropes and beams connected to the lifting platforms you just imagined. Because those lifts were only part of the system. The Colosseum was filled with clever mechanical tricks designed to make events more dramatic, more surprising, and, most importantly, more entertaining for the crowd above. Roman audiences expected spectacle, and Roman engineers were happy to provide it. You picture one of the lift shafts again. A wooden platform sits at the bottom, connected to a network of ropes running through pulleys attached to the ceiling beams. Those ropes lead to a large rotating drum, the capstan, which several workers push from the sides like a giant wheel. When the drum turns, the rope winds up, and the platform rises. It's simple physics. But when 20 or 30 of these lifts operate at once, the result becomes surprisingly complex. Historians studying the Colosseum ruins believe the underground machinery allowed multiple animals or props to appear almost simultaneously across the arena floor. Imagine watching a hunt reenactment in the arena. Suddenly 3 trapdoors burst open. A lion emerges from one. A bear from another. Perhaps a hunter leaps up from a third platform holding a spear. To the spectators, it would feel sudden and thrilling. But beneath the floor, dozens of workers would be coordinating every movement with careful timing. Historians still argue whether the lifts were operated entirely by manpower or whether animals like donkeys sometimes helped power the larger mechanisms. Either option is possible, though human crews were probably more reliable when precise timing mattered. And timing mattered a lot, because arena events often involved elaborate staged scenes. One moment the sand might represent a forest for a hunting demonstration. The next moment scenery panels might rise from hidden slots in the floor, transforming the arena into something resembling a mythological setting. Yes, scenery. The Colosseum sometimes functioned like a giant theatrical stage. Wooden props could be raised through trapdoors, and painted backdrops might be set along certain sections of the arena. Roman audiences loved mythological reenactments where actors dressed as gods or heroes performed dramatic scenes. Although the actors probably hoped their role did not include the phrase, "Enter lion." There's also a curious story mentioned by later Roman writers suggesting that some arena events recreated famous myths, except with slightly uncomfortable realism. For example, a performer playing the role of Icarus might fly using mechanical devices and then fall into the arena. Historians still debate how literal these reenactments were, but Roman audiences were known for enjoying theatrical drama with a strong dose of spectacle. Underneath all this excitement, the machinery had to keep working smoothly. You imagine workers checking ropes for fraying, adjusting pulleys, and ensuring platforms moved freely inside their shafts. Wooden mechanisms can be surprisingly reliable if maintained well, but they also require constant attention. One loose joint or jammed pulley could delay an entire performance above, which might make 50,000 Romans slightly impatient. And Roman crowds, like modern sports fans, were not always known for their quiet patience. The engineers likely trained crews specifically for operating these machines. Groups of workers probably specialized in particular lifts, learning exactly how much force to apply and how quickly to raise the platforms. Think of it like an ancient stage crew, except instead of curtains and lighting rigs, they were managing trapdoors filled with animals. Meanwhile, above the hypogeum, another clever piece of engineering was being installed on the uppermost level of the Colosseum. You tilt your imaginary gaze upward toward the top ring of the building. There, along the highest outer wall, large stone brackets project outward at regular intervals. These brackets once supported tall wooden poles. And those poles supported something remarkable: a giant retractable awning known as the velarium. This enormous fabric canopy stretched over much of the amphitheater, providing shade for spectators sitting in the blazing Roman sun. Because while the Romans enjoyed watching gladiators, they did not necessarily enjoy roasting under Mediterranean heat for several hours. The velarium worked somewhat like the sail of a ship. Sailors from the Roman Navy, stationed specifically for this job, operated the ropes controlling the canopy. By adjusting tension on various lines, they could extend or retract large sections of fabric across the arena. Historians still argue about exactly how much of the seating area the velarium covered. Some scholars believe it shaded most of the spectators while leaving the central arena open. Others think it created partial shade patterns that shifted throughout the day. Either way, it was an impressive piece of engineering. Imagine hundreds of ropes stretching from the top of the Colosseum to nearby anchor points. Sailors tugging and adjusting lines like they were managing the rigging of a gigantic stone ship. Because that's essentially what it was. A stadium with sails. Back underground, the final mechanisms of the hypogeum are nearing completion. Wooden platforms are tested repeatedly. Trapdoors open and close smoothly. Cages slide along tracks into position. Soon the machinery will be ready. Soon the crowds will arrive. And the Colosseum, after years of planning, digging, hauling, carving, and engineering, will finally become what it was always meant to be. Not just a building, but a machine for spectacle. A place where architecture, engineering, and performance combine into something the Roman world had never seen before. And as you stand quietly beneath the arches tonight, it's easy to forget how many hidden systems once worked together beneath these stones. Ropes pulling, wheels turning, platforms rising, all preparing for the moment when the arena above would erupt with sound. You slowly climb back up from the imagined tunnels of the hypogeum, emerging once again into the vast open interior of the Colosseum. The underground machinery may be nearly ready, but above ground another stage of work is still quietly unfolding. Decoration. Because for the Romans, building something enormous was impressive, but making it beautiful was equally important. As the amphitheater neared completion in the late 70s CE, craftsmen across the site were busy adding the finishing touches that would transform the Colosseum from a giant skeleton of stone into a symbol of imperial pride. You picture the structure during these final months of work. Scaffolding still clings to some of the outer arches. Workers move carefully along wooden planks while sculptors chip away at decorative details in the column capitals. Small curls of stone dust drift down as chisels tap against travertine. Below them, painters and plaster workers prepare sections of wall that will soon be covered with color. Yes, color. Many ancient Roman buildings were originally painted in bright pigments. Though most of that color has long since faded away, historians believe parts of the Colosseum's interior walls may have featured painted decorations or patterned plasterwork, giving the corridors and seating areas a far more vibrant appearance than the pale stone we see today. Imagine walking through these halls when the amphitheater was brand new. Fresh plaster gleaming, walls painted with geometric designs or simple borders, marble surfaces reflecting sunlight. The whole structure must have looked dazzling. You continue imagining the finishing process. Inside the lower seating areas, workers install marble slabs along the most prestigious sections. Senators and elite spectators will sit here, so the materials are chosen carefully, smooth, polished, and comfortable enough for long days of entertainment. Some seats are even engraved with names or titles. Reserved seating, Roman style. If you were an important senator arriving late to the games, you could simply locate your name carved into the marble bench and take your place like a VIP at the empire's largest stadium. Above those sections, stone benches remain simpler but still carefully shaped. Carpenters construct railings and barriers to guide crowds safely along corridors and staircases. Because once the Colosseum opens, tens of thousands of people will move through this building at once. Every wall, every step, every entrance must function smoothly. Historians still argue whether additional statues once decorated many of the arches around the outer facade. The rectangular openings on the upper levels may have held bronze or marble statues representing gods, heroes, or members of the imperial family. Imagine the effect. Row after row of statues gazing outward over Rome, turning the amphitheater into not only an arena but also a public display of Roman identity and mythology. Some scholars even suggest that gilded bronze shields or decorative elements might have gleamed along certain sections of the building. If true, the Colosseum would have sparkled under sunlight like a giant crown above the city. And speaking of crowns, there was already a monumental statue nearby. Just to the east of the amphitheater stood the Colossus of Nero, the enormous bronze statue we mentioned earlier. Originally it depicted Emperor Nero himself, standing over 30 meters tall. After Nero's death, however, the statue received a slight rebranding. Roman authorities modified its features so that it resembled the sun god Sol instead of the unpopular former emperor. A few adjustments here, a different inscription there, and suddenly the statue had a much friendlier identity. Historians still argue whether this statue is truly the reason the amphitheater eventually gained the nickname Colosseum. But standing near such a gigantic bronze figure probably made the association quite natural. You imagine visitors approaching the area during the final construction months. The massive amphitheater now stands complete. 4 stories tall. Rows of arches circling the arena. The upper level fitted with poles ready to support the great velarium canopy. Workers removed the last scaffolding from the facade. Suddenly the building appears in its full glory for the first time. It must have been breathtaking. Rome already possessed impressive structures like the Baths of Caracalla and the Pantheon, but the Colosseum was something different. A monument dedicated entirely to entertainment. A public gathering space on a scale few cities had ever attempted. One curious historical tidbit suggests that finishing touches included sprinkling fresh sand across the arena floor, carefully leveling it to create a smooth performance surface. The Latin word for sand, harina, is actually where the modern word, arena, comes from. So when we talk about arenas today, we're literally using the Roman term for the sandy stage where spectacles occurred. Language has a funny way of preserving ancient details. As the Colosseum's completion approaches, preparations also begin for the grand opening ceremonies. These events will need to be bigger than anything Rome has ever seen. Because the amphitheater is not just another public building. It is the flagship project of the Flavian dynasty. Vespasian began it. His son Titus will finish it. And the opening celebration will demonstrate to the entire empire that the new ruling family has restored Rome's greatness after the chaos of civil war. You imagine the final days before opening. Workers sweep corridors, inspect trapdoors, test lifting platforms beneath the arena. The velarium ropes are checked by experienced sailors from the Roman fleet. And officials walk through the seating tiers making sure every section is ready for thousands of spectators. After nearly a decade of labor, the Colosseum finally stands complete. Stone arches, marble seats, hidden machinery, decorative statues, everything waiting for the first crowd to arrive. And when that moment comes, the amphitheater will erupt into life in a way that few buildings in history ever have. Because the opening of the Colosseum will not be a quiet ceremony. It will be a spectacle lasting days, perhaps even months, filled with games, hunts, performances, and events so large that Roman historians will still be writing about them centuries later. The great amphitheater is ready, and Rome is about to celebrate. You imagine the morning when the Colosseum finally opens. After nearly a decade of construction, the enormous amphitheater stands ready, its fresh stone walls glowing in the Roman sunlight. The arches are clean and sharp. The seating tiers stretch high above the arena, and the velarium poles line the top edge like the masts of a great ship waiting to unfurl its sails. Today, Rome is not quiet. Today, Rome is buzzing. Because Emperor Titus, son of Vespasian and the man who completed the project, has organized a grand inaugural celebration unlike anything the empire has seen before. The year is 80 CE. And if you were walking through Rome that morning, you would hear the excitement long before you even saw the Colosseum. Vendors shouting, crowds gathering, soldiers directing foot traffic through the surrounding streets. You picture thousands of spectators approaching the amphitheater from every direction. People pour through the 80 entrances, guided by numbered arches and narrow corridors leading toward their assigned seating levels. The circulation system that Roman engineers carefully designed finally proves its brilliance. Even with tens of thousands of people arriving, the building absorbs the crowd smoothly. No crushing bottlenecks. No chaos. Just a steady flow of sandals scraping stone as spectators climb toward their seats. Above them, sailors from the Roman Navy prepare the great velarium canopy. Teams pull ropes that stretch across the top of the amphitheater, slowly unfurling wide sections of cloth that cast patches of shade over the seating tiers. From a distance, the canopy must look like a massive sail billowing over the arena. Inside, the seating fills quickly. Senators take their marble benches near the arena floor. Wealthy citizens settle into the middle tiers. Common Romans fill the higher rows, bringing cushions, snacks, and plenty of anticipation. Historians generally agree that the opening celebrations lasted around 100 days. 100. Imagine attending a stadium event today that continues for over 3 months. That's not a weekend tournament. That's practically a lifestyle. Ancient writers such as the Roman historian Dio Cassius describe the scale of the opening games as staggering. Thousands of animals were reportedly killed during hunts staged in the arena. Lions, leopards, bears, elephants. Some accounts even mention giraffes and other exotic creatures brought from distant provinces of the empire. Rome loved spectacle, and the Colosseum's opening delivered it in abundance. But not every event involved combat. The games also included theatrical performances, mythological reenactments, athletic displays, and dramatic staged hunts known as venationes. These hunts were particularly popular. Professional hunters, called bestiarii, faced wild animals in choreographed contests that showcased bravery, skill, and occasionally pure survival instinct. You imagine the arena floor on one of those early days. Fresh sand spread evenly across the surface. Bright sunlight filtering through the velarium canopy above. 50,000 spectators leaning forward in their seats. Then suddenly a trapdoor opens. A platform rises from the hypogeum. A lion appears. The crowd erupts. The hidden machinery beneath the arena, those lifts and cages we explored earlier, is finally doing exactly what Roman engineers designed it to do. Deliver surprise. Deliver drama. Deliver spectacle. Historians still argue about some of the more unusual events described in ancient sources. One particularly intriguing claim suggests that the arena may have been flooded briefly for mock naval battles known as naumachia. These staged sea battles were extremely rare and difficult to organize. While earlier Roman emperors had constructed special basins for such events, it remains debated whether the Colosseum itself ever hosted full naval battles after the hypogeum was installed. Some scholars believe the earliest opening ceremonies may have included shallow water displays before the underground machinery was completed. Others think ancient writers exaggerated the story. Either way, the idea of a giant amphitheater briefly turning into a miniature sea battle arena is wonderfully dramatic. Although the Roman stage crew beneath the arena probably would have needed several strong cups of wine afterward. You imagine the atmosphere inside the Colosseum during those opening days. The roar of the crowd echoes against the stone walls. Trumpets announce new events. Vendors move through the seating rows selling bread, olives, wine, and snacks. Children sit wide-eyed beside their parents watching performances unfold in the sand. It's noisy, energetic, almost overwhelming. And yet the building itself handles the crowds beautifully. Corridors guide people in and out. Stairways distribute traffic across the tiers. The amphitheater functions exactly as its designers intended. A giant machine for public gathering. A monument not just to architecture but to social life in the Roman world. You imagine Emperor Titus seated in a special imperial box overlooking the arena. From here he can see the entire amphitheater, the arches, the crowds, the performers, the enormous success of the project his father began. For the Flavian dynasty, the Colosseum is more than entertainment. It's a political triumph, a symbol that Rome has recovered from civil war. a gift to the people that replaces Nero's private lake with something shared by the entire city. And judging by the cheering crowds filling every seat, the gift is very well received. As the opening celebrations continue day after day, the Colosseum becomes the beating heart of Rome's public life. Thousands attend each event. Stories spread across the empire. Travelers arrive hoping to witness the spectacle for themselves. The great amphitheater is no longer a construction site. It is alive. Alive with voices. Alive with excitement. Alive with the energy of an empire gathering in one place. And yet, even as the crowds celebrate, the Colosseum's story is only beginning. Because buildings like this do not simply remain frozen in time. They change. They adapt. They survive earthquakes, repairs, and centuries of history that no architect could have fully predicted. The stone arena that opened with such triumph will continue evolving long after the first cheers fade. The cheering crowds eventually go home. Even a 100-day celebration must end at some point, though Roman spectators probably tried very hard to convince Emperor Titus otherwise. When the final games conclude and the last vendors pack up their baskets of olives and bread, the Colosseum settles into its long life as Rome's most famous entertainment venue. And that life stretches far beyond the opening ceremony. You imagine the amphitheater a few years later. The stone is no longer brand new, but the building is still magnificent. Thousands of Romans continue streaming through its 80 entrances whenever games are announced. Gladiatorial contests become the main attraction. Professional fighters trained in special schools known as ludi travel to the arena to compete. These gladiators are not random volunteers swinging swords wildly. They are highly trained athletes with specialized fighting styles. One might carry a short sword and large shield. Another fights with a trident and net. A third wears heavier armor and moves slowly but powerfully. Roman audiences quickly develop favorite fighters, cheering for particular gladiators much like modern fans cheer for sports teams. And yes, betting almost certainly happens. You can practically hear the crowd arguing in the stands. 5 coins says the Murmillo wins. Not a chance. Look at the Retiarius reach. Some things about sports crowds never really change. Meanwhile, the hypogeum beneath the arena continues operating day after day. Workers raise cages, reset trapdoors, and prepare animals for hunts. The complex machinery installed during construction proves remarkably durable. Roman engineers knew their craft. Historians still argue whether the underground mechanisms were periodically upgraded during later emperors' reigns. It's possible that additional lifts or improved pulley systems were added over time as engineers learned how to run the arena more efficiently. Buildings that stay in use for centuries rarely remain exactly the same. And the Colosseum will remain in use for a very long time. But life in ancient Rome is not always peaceful. Earthquakes occasionally shake the city, and large stone buildings must endure those shocks. One early quake during the reign of Emperor Antoninus Pius in the 2nd century may have damaged parts of the amphitheater, requiring repairs to certain upper sections. Fortunately, Roman construction techniques, those thick walls, layered arches, and iron clamps, make the Colosseum surprisingly resilient. Repairs are completed. Games continue. The arena keeps hosting events for generations. Over the centuries, different emperors modify or restore parts of the structure. New statues might be installed, damaged seating repaired, sections reinforced after storms or earthquakes. One emperor even experiments with unusual stage effects. According to some ancient sources, elaborate scenery and mechanical devices sometimes allowed the arena to recreate forests, mountains, or mythological landscapes during performances. Imagine arriving one morning to find the arena transformed into a miniature wilderness. Trees, rocks, hidden cages waiting beneath the sand. It would feel less like a stadium and more like stepping into a theatrical fantasy world. There's also a strange historical anecdote suggesting that rare midday shows included trained animals performing tricks, almost like ancient circus acts. Lions might be guided through choreographed movements. Bears could be coaxed into standing upright. Historians still debate how common these performances were, but Roman audiences clearly appreciated novelty. Although personally, if someone told you the trained bear show was next on the schedule, you might sit a little farther back in your seat. As centuries pass, the political world surrounding the Colosseum slowly changes. The Roman Empire evolves, emperors come and go, and public tastes shift. By the 4th century, gladiatorial combat begins to decline. Several factors contribute to this change. Christianity spreads throughout the empire, bringing new attitudes toward blood sports. Economic pressures also make large-scale games more difficult to organize. Eventually, in the early 5th century, gladiatorial contests are officially banned. The arena that once echoed with the clash of swords grows quieter. Animal hunts continue for a while longer, but even those gradually disappear as the empire's resources shrink. You imagine the Colosseum during this later period. The massive structure still stands proudly over Rome, but the crowds are smaller. The once constant roar of spectators has faded to occasional gatherings. The machinery beneath the arena slowly falls silent. Wooden lifts decay. Ropes rot. Trapdoors remain closed. Historians still argue about exactly when the hypogeum machinery stopped functioning, but by the later centuries of the empire it was probably no longer maintained regularly. Without constant repairs, wooden mechanisms simply cannot survive. Yet the building itself remains astonishingly durable. Stone arches still support the tiers. Corridors still wind through the structure. Even without gains, the Colosseum continues to dominate the Roman skyline. And its story is not finished. Because after the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century, the amphitheater begins an entirely new chapter of life, one that its original builders never imagined. The arena that once hosted emperors and gladiators will slowly transform into something very different. A fortress, a neighborhood, a quarry for building materials, and eventually, centuries later, one of the most recognizable historical monuments in the world. But for now, in this quiet moment between ages, you stand inside the great amphitheater imagining the echoes of its past. The cheers, the trumpets, the roar of lions emerging from hidden platforms, all fading gently into history. The centuries drift onward, and the Colosseum slowly begins to live a quieter life. Not because the building disappears, far from it, but because the world around it is changing. You imagine walking through Rome sometime in the early Middle Ages. The empire that once organized enormous games and spectacles has long since faded. Emperors no longer sit in marble viewing boxes. Gladiators are no longer training for combat beneath the arena floor. But the Colosseum still stands. Its massive outer walls remain almost impossibly strong. The tiers of arches still rise above the city like the ribs of a giant stone creature resting beside the Roman Forum. Without the crowds of games, however, the amphitheater slowly becomes something else. At first, people simply reuse parts of it. After centuries of earthquakes and neglect, pieces of the outer walls occasionally collapse. The fallen stones are large, perfectly cut blocks of travertine, exactly the kind of material medieval builders would love to have. And so, bit by bit, sections of the Colosseum begin to serve as a quarry. Blocks are removed and reused in churches, palaces, and other buildings throughout Rome. Historians believe that stones from the Colosseum may have ended up in famous structures like St. Peter's Basilica centuries later. The ancient arena quietly becomes part of the city's future architecture. You could almost think of it as recycling. Roman addition. Although the original architects might raise an eyebrow at the idea of their masterpiece slowly being disassembled. During the medieval period, Another surprising transformation occurs. Families move into the Colosseum. Yes, into it. Parts of the amphitheater become homes, workshops, storage spaces, and even small gardens. The interior corridors and arches create sheltered spaces perfect for building simple dwellings. Imagine a small medieval neighborhood tucked inside the ruins of the world's greatest stadium. Children running through old passageways. Laundry hanging between ancient columns. Chickens wandering past walls that once echoed with gladiator battles. History has a wonderful sense of irony sometimes. At one point in the 12th century, the powerful Frangipani family even turns the Colosseum into a fortress. Defensive walls and towers are added to parts of the structure, transforming the old arena into a medieval stronghold during Rome's turbulent political struggles. The building proves once again how sturdy its design truly is. Those massive Roman arches were not just impressive, they were incredibly practical. Even when repurposed as a fortress, the Colosseum continues to stand. Historians still argue about how much of the structure remained intact during these medieval centuries. Some records suggest that large portions of the outer ring were still standing before later earthquakes caused additional damage. One particularly destructive earthquake in 1349 likely collapsed major sections of the southern outer wall, the broken area visitors still notice today. The fallen stone blocks from that collapse provided even more building material for Renaissance Rome. Yet despite all this dismantling, the core of the amphitheater survives. Because by the 18th century, attitudes toward the Colosseum begin to change again. Instead of seeing it as a convenient source of stone, people begin to recognize its historical importance. The ruins become a symbol of ancient Rome itself. Popes declare the site sacred, partly because many believed early Christians had been martyred there, though historians still debate how frequently that actually occurred. Either way, preservation efforts slowly begin. Stone removal stops. Repairs stabilize the surviving walls. The Colosseum transforms once again, this time into a monument rather than a functioning building. And that brings you back to the present moment. You stand quietly in your imagination inside the great arena, looking around at walls that have witnessed nearly 2,000 years of history. Construction crews hauling travertine blocks. Engineers designing clever lifts and pulleys beneath the sand. Crowds cheering during the opening games of Emperor Titus. Gladiators, hunters, sailors controlling the velarium above. Medieval families living inside its arches. Earthquakes shaking its foundations. And modern visitors walking slowly through the same corridors tonight. The Colosseum has lived many lives. But the most fascinating part might still be the beginning, the slow, careful construction that turned a drained lake from Nero's palace into the greatest amphitheater the ancient world ever built. Thousands of workers, millions of stones, years of planning, lifting, carving, and assembling. A masterpiece built piece by piece. And now, as the night grows quieter in your imagination, the massive arches seem softer somehow. The wind drifts gently through the empty arena. The crowds are gone. The machinery beneath the sand has long since fallen silent. But the structure itself remains, patiently watching centuries pass by. You take one last slow look around the ancient amphitheater. The towering walls. The endless rows of arches. The quiet sand of the arena floor. And as your thoughts begin to settle, the Colosseum no longer feels like a place of noise or spectacle. Instead, it feels calm, ancient, still, a giant stone reminder that even the grandest human creations are built slowly, patiently, one block at a time. And somehow, that quiet patience makes the whole place feel almost peaceful. The air grows softer now as your mind drifts through the long story you've just wandered across. The Colosseum rests beneath a gentle Roman night, its arches glowing faintly under distant lantern light. You imagine the last workers leaving the site nearly 2,000 years ago. Their tools set down after years of labor. The ropes are coiled. The pulleys rest. The fresh sand of the arena waits quietly for the next day's events. The wind moves slowly through the corridors, brushing past stone that has endured emperors, crowds, earthquakes, and centuries of change. And somehow, despite all those noisy moments of history, the building itself now feels calm. The arches breathe in the cool night air. The vast arena lies still beneath the stars. If you listen closely, you might almost hear the distant echoes of footsteps from long ago, workers hauling stone, sailors adjusting ropes, spectators climbing the stairs. But those sounds fade gently into silence, like waves slowly settling on a quiet shore. The Colosseum remains, patient and unmoving, watching time drift forward the way it always has. And as the story finally settles, the ancient amphitheater grows quieter and quieter, until only the soft whisper of the Roman night remains. End of script. Sweet dreams.